All right, so let's go with module 1. I have some pictures. I try to put a picture for every week, and this is the first one. All right, so first question. Why are attacks successful? Attacks can be successful for example, widespread vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are common in hardware and in software, and attackers can pick which vulnerabilities to exploit for an attack. There is a lack of vendor support and end-of-life systems. Two simple examples that make widespread vulnerabilities worse. For example, cell phones. Android phones are everywhere, and they have different versions of Android running in them. They don't all run the same updated version, so it leaves a very wide vector of attack through an Android phone. iOS. Apple drops certain phones after a couple years of service. But does that mean that all the users stop using that phone? Not really. iPhones are expensive. So people try to use them as much as possible. But those phones no longer get updates. But they're out in the wild being used for everything. That can lead to that adding the widespread vulnerabilities. You have more ways of attacks being successful because those phones are no longer supported. People still use Windows XP and Windows 7 on a day-to-day basis, either in their office or on infrastructure or on even critical systems. If those are connected to the internet, you have more ways of getting vulnerabilities in. Another reason for successful attacks are configuration issues. Hardware and software that doesn't have security features are often not properly configured. Almost all devices have default configurations. These are intended by the manufacturer to be changed by the user, but more often than not, they're just left in place. A lot of them have weak configurations with limited security choices. Misconfigurations allow devices to be compromised. Improperly configured accounts tend to provide the entryway for an attack. Let me ask you now, have you looked at your router settings? Have you spent time seeing what is there? If when you got your router from AT&T or Verizon or Xfinity or whatever, they just set it up and you connected your stuff and moved on. That's one of the ways that these attacks occur through, because nobody went back to review the settings, nobody went back to adjust, so it left the door wide open. Another reason for successful attack is poorly designed software. Successful attacks are often the result of architecture or design weaknesses, such as improper input handling, improper error handling, or even race conditions. A lot of the time, code is written just for a certain purpose and isn't really thoroughly tested, and then it's thrown into production and put out in the world. That is another way that attackers leverage those misconfigurations, those improperly built software, and get into systems. There's also hardware limitations as another successful attack. Hardware with limited resources like CPU, RAM, or storage can be exploited to consume more resources than intended. This causes resource exhaustion. Case in point, Internet of Things. Your thermostat, your smart toaster, your smart fridge, all that kind of stuff has very limited resources and therefore doesn't have enough capability to do things like encryption. Therefore, it leaves the door wide open. And then, of course, things like enterprise-based issues, manipulating business actions that are routinely performed. So the difficulties in defending against attacks. You have a lot of universally connected devices. Now, virtually every technology device is now connected to the internet. There's an increased speed of attacks. There's greater sophistication of these attacks. Tools have made attacks very simple to execute. There's faster detection for vulnerabilities like 0 days, ones that have no fix. There are weak security update distributions, like with Android, for example, or Apple with old phones. There's distributed attacks using millions of devices in order to launch attacks. There's the high use, especially right now, the high use of personal devices and user configuration, which to me is the worst of them all because you can't necessarily control things like people finding 0 days, and you can't necessarily control people creating tools that simplify attacks, but you can do something about user configuration. And if you're not doing something about it, then there's your big problem. In this course, this is the defining principle. The higher security goes, the lower convenience becomes. Thus, the reverse is true. If something is much more convenient, its security is less. This is the good old CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The big three, they used to be the way to explain security, as confidentiality being only authorized parties may view the information, integrity, information is correct and unaltered, and availability, information is accessible to the authorized users. But things aren't so black and white because things are layered, because there's a lot of other vendors, a lot of new technology. So it's getting pretty crazy to something like this, where you have the products that form security around the data, like door locks to network security equipment. You have the people who implement and properly use security products to protect data, and policies established by enterprise to ensure people correctly use the products. You also have more terms that you'll need to be familiar with, like asset. Every item has a value, from a laptop to a vehicle to data. There's the threat, the type of action that has the potential to cause harm, like stealing or destroying. The threat actor is the person who carries out that threat, like a person or a cat or a tornado. The vulnerability is a flaw or weakness that allows a threat agent to bypass security, for example, leaving a door open or leaving an open port. The threat vector, the means by which an attack can occur, for example, climbing through a hole in a fence or logging in with weak credentials. There is risk, the situation that involves exposure to some type of danger. Our entire existence as cybersecurity professionals revolves around risk. we will either do one of four things. We'll either accept the risk. For example, the front door of our office will remain open during business hours. The risk is if somebody wants to storm in, they will be able to because the door is unlocked. There is transfer of risk. We will purchase insurance to cover the cost. There is avoidance. For example, not updating to the latest operating system because we know it has flaws. And mitigation, installing firewalls, secure passwords, two-factor authentication, door locks, all that kind of stuff. Understanding the importance of information security, of what we're going to talk about in this class. Well, one of the ways that this is helpful is preventing data theft. It's normally the primary objective of an organization's information security team is to prevent data theft. Enterprise data theft involves stealing proprietary business information, whereas personal data theft could be stealing credit card numbers. There's also identity theft, stealing another person's personal information. That could be like SSN, credit card accounts, fraudulent tax returns, medical data. There's also the legal consequences. Depending on what industry you will end up providing security for will depend on what you need to know. For example, if you are doing health, you need to be more than familiar with the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA. If you're doing anything corporate governance and financial practice, that is the Sarbanes-Oxley, or Sarbox. If your company is offering financial products or services like loans, financial advice, insurance, that falls under the Graham-Lee-Billy Act, or GLBA. If you handle credit cards, it's the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS. Maintaining security is important in maintaining productivity. The amount of time that is spent taking systems down hurts the bottom dollar. And that our companies do not like. For example, if a company is 100 employees strong and the average salary is $25, and there is one employee hired to combat any attacks, it'll take them about 48 hours to stop that attack and clean it up. That means lost salaries is $4,000, and they will lose 81 hours of productivity. The more employees you have, the more possible salaries are lost when things have to be taken down. And that's just not good that's just not good from the company perspective. Who are your threat actors? Well, your threat actors are basically just a generic term that describes an individual or a group who launches attacks against others and their computers. They could be showing off their skills or financial gain, or have more nefarious reasons. For example, script kiddies. They download automated hacking software from websites like GitHub while lacking the knowledge of computers and networks. Over 40% of attacks require low or no skill because of available tools. Another group is hacktivists. Generally not well defined and well organized, they will break into websites, change content on them to make a political statement. They could be acting retaliatory, like disabling a website. They are known to support a wide variety of causes. They don't really show particular allegiance with those who oppose them. You have nation state actors targeting foreign governments or even citizens of foreign governments who are considered hostile and threatening. They are well resourced and highly trained and use advanced persistent threats against their targets. And the one group that I personally feel are the worst, the insiders, because they are authorized to access information. They are legitimate users of our networks, legitimate users of the data we protect. How do you know? How can you detect when somebody who's supposed to be trusted, an employee, a coworker, becomes an insider threat? And then we have a list of other threat actors, like competitors, like Pepsi and Coke, organized crime, like the Goodfellas, the Godfather, brokers who sell their knowledge of vulnerability in order to launch attacks, and cyber terrorists. All real threats that we have to watch out for. Lastly, we'll talk about defending against attacks, with the first one being layering. Information security must be created in layers, since a single defense mechanism may be easy to circumvent, making it unlikely that an attacker can break through all defense layers. This is also called defense in depth, which can be useful in resisting a variety of attacks and provide the most comprehensive protection. You have diversity. Having multiple devices from different vendors will allow you to not become fully vulnerable to a single attack. There have been a number of times when, for example, Cisco Systems has a vulnerability out for all their devices, like a built-in root password or other vulnerability. If you are an entire Cisco shop, you are completely vulnerable. But if you have things like Cisco switches paired up with pfSense firewalls or Juniper firewalls, or other, or Palo Alto networks, you scatter different vendors into your infrastructure, you lower down that amount of risk that you're taking on your network. There's limiting access to information reduces the threat against it, as only those who must use the data should be granted access. All users should be limited to only what they need to do their job, either through technology-based, like file permissions, or procedural, like prohibiting document removal from the premises. There's also obscurity, obscuring inside details to outsiders, such as not revealing the type of computers, the operating systems, or brands of software used internally. This will make it difficult for an attacker to know what devices exist if details are unknown. There are a number of industry frameworks that we'll talk about throughout the semester that you can implement, not only on your home network, but on your business network. lab networks, and so on. So we'll dive into, for example, the financial industry has certain guidelines. Health has certain guidelines that must be followed. So we'll talk about them as we go on through the course. Are there any questions on the content? Looking at Zoom, Discord, YouTube. No questions on content? Excellent. So this week, what you will do is join the Google Cloud Platform. And I have a set of instructions for you. I suggest using a Google account that is not your primary Google account to log in. Create a dummy account and then jump into the Google Cloud Platform, where you'll go through a few steps to get ready to create virtual machines. And then you'll create a Windows VM and a Linux VM. This is really to get your feet wet, to help you get started in building out your lab infrastructure for the semester. There is also a review quiz on the content we just covered. And like I said in the orientation, these NetLab activities are all extra credit and not required to be done. I am waiting on Google to provide me with the credits for you. So you can start creating your account, and you should be able to create Linux machines. I'm pretty sure Windows, you have to have the credits in order to use. So I would just hang on tight. I should get those credits soon enough, and then we'll be able to create Windows VMs and go from there. Are there any questions on this week's work or this week's assignments? All right. And I'll